what we're talking about today is neural communication. Now, what is this thing doing? Oh, I don't want, hold on one sec. All right, whatever. What we're talking about today is neural communication. So we talked last time about the structure of a neuron. Go ahead and get out those two neurons that I had you draw last time, because I'm going to want you to kind of use that. You can draw some stuff on there. We talked about the structure. Now we got to talk about how they communicate with each other. Now, I would say in terms of specific content in this class that students have the hardest time with, I think this is one of the topics. But I think it is, again, just because it's biology, but it's a psychology class, and you don't necessarily think about biology a whole lot with psychology. I know that like some of the stuff you all do in biology class, in Bronstats class, I think is more challenging than this. Okay, I was even looking at some stuff today, and I was like, wow, I didn't realize that some of the stuff in bio was this hard. So I think that if you look at it from just this is biology and not just psychology, I think it does get easier. I also think that students get bogged down in details in this stuff. And really, if you just, what this is knowing definitions and knowing like a step-by-step process. And if you don't get bogged down in stuff, I actually don't think this process of neural communication is all that difficult. Okay, but I'm gonna explain it as best I can in the easiest possible terms that I can. But I need for you to ask questions if you have questions. All right, last class was actually really good about asking questions and was really like asking like sort of like extension questions, which is good. All right, so I want you to write this down on that sheet, okay, on the two neurons. Communication within a neuron is electrical. Communication between neurons is chemical. This is very important. This is a test question. This will be on the Unit 2 test. There will be a question that says, communication within a neuron is blank, communication between neurons is blank, and you have to choose the right answer. Okay? All right, so the first thing that we are going to talk about is the electrical component of neural communication. Okay, neurons use both electricity and chemical signals to communicate, except for the ones in the heart, which are all electrical. So we're going to first talk about the electrical component of it. Okay, what is called a neural impulse. Okay. But before we talk about that neural impulse, we have to talk about what happens when nothing's happening. Come on, where's my mouse? So when a neuron is just chilling, all right, not doing anything, but it has the ability to fire to communicate with other neurons. it is said to have resting potential. Okay? It is resting, but it has the potential to do something. Just like, if you're sitting on the couch, you're resting, but you always have the potential to do something, but you're not doing anything. So we can talk about this with like, let's say, motor neurons while you're sleeping. Okay. While you're sleeping, you don't move a whole lot. So most of those motor neurons while you're sleeping just have resting potential. They're just hanging out. They're not doing anything. Okay. What that means in terms of science and biology is that when a neuron has resting potential, when it's not doing anything, it is negatively charged, meaning the inside of the axon, the inside of the axon has a negative charge. The inside of the axon, oh, sorry, one sec, guys. Where's I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find my mute button. There we go. Set up your own next 2 weeks. Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, no problem. Okay, sorry about that. Miss Fernandez came in. All right. So when a neuron is not doing anything, when it's resting, the inside of it is negatively charged. It has negative potassium ions on the inside of it. Okay. It's generally around negative 70 millivolts inside, and is what is called polarized. Okay. The inside is negative, and then outside of the neuron is positive. It's positive sodium ions. What does the word polarized mean? Okay, it means it has a charge. In general, not even like scientifically, what does the word polarized mean? If what? Yeah, yeah, opposite. Yeah. If you say like Donald Trump is very polarizing, okay, that means that people generally either really like him or really dislike him. Okay, yep. Polarized is the extreme. So when a neuron is just hanging out, it and has resting potential, it sits at about negative 70 inside of the neuron. Okay, so I doubt you'd ever be asked that voltage, but just know it's polarized. All right, any questions there? It just it just means that that specific neuron, whatever that neuron is, isn't doing anything at that time. So like to think of, so like this is what happens when, so when you're wearing, like when you wear a watch for a while and you feel it at first and then the receptors in your skin like basically get used to it. You all know what I'm talking about. It's called sensory adaptation. So once it gets used to it, like those neurons that would send that touch signal from your wrist to your brain have stopped being activated. So they're just resting at the time. Okay. Or if you're not eating anything, like the taste buds, your taste buds aren't activating your taste neurons in your tongue. So they're just resting. Okay. It's just whenever a neuron's just not doing anything. Okay. All right. So I put a bunch of these 2-minute neuroscience videos in here. I think these are really good. I think they're better than the crash course psychology, mostly because I can't stand Hank Green. So for there to be a neural impulse, right, a neural impulse is what is called an action potential. An action potential is an electrical charge that travels down the axon. It starts at the dendrite, goes through the cell body. Sorry, this thing's really hard to write on. and then goes to the axon. You can see here, like this is kind of like, just like a graphic. All right, the little bright dots on there would be the electrical impulse traveling down the axon. This is called an action potential. Where these come from is when any sort of event or stimulus that causes a resting neuron to activate. Okay, it can be activity on sensory receptors, like on your skin or on your tongue, that activate neurons, or it can just be one neuron activating another neuron. This activation, this event, this stimulus, this neurotransmitter, whatever, causes the neuron that is resting to start to depolarize, meaning the inside of it starts going towards zero. And next slide, I'm going to explain like how that happens. Okay, so you can see here, all right, neurons resting, and then all of a sudden, right there, can't get to it, okay, right there, where it starts going up is where this guy right here gets kicked in the nuts. Okay, that's the event or the stimulus that activates those neurons and takes a resting neuron with resting potential into the possibility of firing. All right. So an action potential occurs when a neuron starts to depolarize. Any questions here before we get into kind of how this happens? So when there is some sort of event, whatever it is, again, it could either be a stimulus, it could be touch, it could be sound, it could just be one neuron activating another neuron. Okay, the neurons start to depolarize. What starts happening is the membrane of the axon starts to let in positively charged sodium ions and let out negatively charged potassium ions. Okay, it's what's called something called a sodium potassium pump. I think a lot of you all have heard of this before in biology, I believe, right? Yep. Okay, so as it starts to depolarize, whether it's from a neurotransmitter signal or getting kicked in the groin or whatnot, as it starts to depolarize, it needs, for there to be an action potential, it needs to reach what is called the threshold. The threshold is the minimum amount of stimulation a neuron needs for it to fire, for there to be an action potential. This threshold, this neural threshold during depolarization, is about negative 55 millivolts. So what that means is the inside of the neuron has to depolarize to negative 55 millivolts for there to be an action potential. When this happens, these different ions, the sodium and potassium ions, diffuse across the membrane. Sodium ions come in, potassium ions go out. This causes, the neuron to continue to depolarize. Okay, so you can see right here. Basically, in an axon, there are gates, and like a gate will open, and and the electrical current will travel through it, and then another gate will open, and another gate, and so on and so forth. Now, So the threshold is when once that depolarization reaches negative 55. Once it reaches the threshold, this is really important. Once it reaches the threshold, okay, here's just another diagram right here. Once it reaches the threshold and there is an action potential, this action potential is known as an all or none response. What that means is as long as it polarizes to the threshold, that neuron is firing no matter what. All it has to do is reach the threshold and the neuron will fire with the same intensity each time. So you may think that like when something hurts more, that like more than like flicking your finger versus hitting your hand with a hammer. You might think that the hitting your hand with a hammer is because those neural impulses are stronger. It's actually not. All the neural impulses are the same intensity each time. It's just more of them when you hit your hand with a hammer. Okay, so if the threshold is met, the neuron will continue to depolarize and let the electrical current travel through it. A lot of that has to do with the amount of sensory receptors that are in different areas of the body. So we'll actually talk about this later on in this unit. But like, you know, you can sneak up behind somebody and like touch them on their elbow, and they may not even be able to feel that they're being touched because they don't have a whole lot of sensory receptors in that area. And actually, less of your brain is dedicated to touch in that area. Whereas your hands or like your nose or whatnot are a lot more sensitive. So a lot of it has to do with how sensitive certain areas of the body are too. Okay, so action potentials are like a gun or a toilet. Okay, a gun, can you halfway fire a gun? Can you like, if you like pull the trigger real lightly, is it going to just be like, pew? Okay, and as opposed to if you pull it really hard? No. Okay, as long, those of you who have fired a gun before know this, like you can pull the trigger as lightly as you want, and as soon as you hit that threshold of how many pounds it takes, usually it's like 2 to 3 pounds of pressure, that gun's going off no matter what. And it's going off at the same intensity each time. Toilets are the same way. More of you have experience with toilets. Okay, you can flush the toilet really lightly, or you can flush the toilet really hard, but it's going to flush with the same intensity each time. Okay, action potentials are the same way. As long as you reach that neural threshold of negative 55 millivolts in depolarization, that neuron's going to fire. This is called the all or none response. Yeah, yeah, yeah. If like if a stimulus, so it depends. This kind of depends on if it happens in the brain or in the sensory receptors. But if there's some sort of sensory stimulus in the environment, like let's say, we'll talk about this next unit, but like let's say that there's some smell particles in your environment, but there aren't enough of them to trigger enough neurons to enough sensory receptors to pick them up, then those neurons like wouldn't fire. Like the smell threshold would not be met for you to be able to smell something. It's actually called absolute threshold. Good question, Landon. All right. Any other questions here? We're almost done. We've got a little bit more. Okay. All right. Now, so there's the electrical signal that travels down the axon, okay? It reaches the terminal buttons, and we're going to talk about this next, but this electrical signal causes the release of neurotransmitters from the terminal buttons. Last thing with the electricity part of it. After an action potential, once it reaches about positive 30 polarization, all right, it drops down really quickly. It goes boom, and then it pops back down. And because it drops so fast, it goes into what, and this, just so we know, guys, this is all happening in like the millionth of a millisecond. People always ask me, like, well, how do we know, how long does this take? Like, it's happening over and over and over and over, like right as we're doing this. Action potentials travel generally at about 250 miles an hour. So it goes into what's called hyperpolarization, where it drops below -70. This is what is referred to as the refractory period. There is a brief moment in the electrical component where a neuron cannot fire again, where it has to recharge. Just like with a toilet, you can't just go and just flush to your little heart's content. All right, you got to flush, you got to wait for it to refill, and then you got to flush again if you need to. There's also something else that we'll talk about later on in this class when we get to sexual motivation. There's something in the male sexual response cycle called the refractory period. Okay, and so you can maybe guess. So once a neuron has fired, it has to recharge for a split second before it can fire again. Okay? Are there any questions there about the electrical component of neural transmission? Okay, so we got some sort of stimulus, neurotransmitter, whatnot. As long as the strength of it reaches the threshold, there's going to be an action potential, electrical signal that travels down the neuron, travels down to the axon terminal, which triggers the release of neurotransmitters, and then neuron repolarizes for a split second before it can fire again. Okay, now we've got to talk about what happens once that action potential gets down to the axon terminal, to the end of the axon. Okay, so this is the chemical component. The action potential travels down the axon. Okay, it's the electrical current that travels down. At the axon terminal, and this would be a good spot, guys, too, on your diagram, on the first neuron, you can like draw an arrow going down the axon and then put something like maybe like a lightning bolt or something by it so that you know that that's the electrical signal traveling down the axon. Okay, so that electrical signal travels down the axon to the end of the axon, what is known as the axon terminal, or the terminal button, which is right here. The terminal button contains neurotransmitters. They're in these little sacs called vesicles in there. Okay, so, and that's where they're produced. So the electrical current travels down to the axon terminal. This is also called the firing neuron or the presynaptic neuron because it's before the synapse. Okay, you can see right here, before, after. I don't know why, I'm pointing, I don't know why, you can't see my fingers. All right, and what that electrical current does is it triggers the release just like right here, of these chemical messengers into the synaptic gap, which is the gap in between the axon terminal and the dendrite. What they do is basically the vesicles fuse to the wall of the axon terminal, and then that releases these neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. They're on little like transporter proteins. It's kind of like they're like riding, they're like in like little on like little jet skis crossing across. Okay. This neuron right here, the dendrite, they are going to travel over to called the receiving neuron or the postsynaptic neuron because it's the end of the synapse. All right. So right now they're in the synaptic gap. You might want to, in that picture, you might want to draw like put some little dots in that synaptic gap right there. All right. Any questions? Don't have much more. Yes. Yep. So what happens now is these chemical messengers, because the electrical signal can't travel across the synapse, right? It has to use these chemical signals, these neurotransmitters. So what they do is they travel across the synaptic gap, and on the dendrite, there are what are called receptor sites. That's the dendrite right there. And that's the axon terminal right there. And what they do, these chemical messengers bind at these receptor sites on the dendrite. Now, neurotransmitters and receptor sites on the dendritic spines are what is called lock and key. Now, I know you all learn about that with enzymes. What does lock and key mean? Yeah, like only one enzyme can go with a certain catalyst, right? Is that what it means? Yeah. Okay. Neurotransmitters and receptor sites are the same way. Okay. If a receptor site looks like that, then the neurotransmitter's got to look like that. So these chemicals bind at the receptor sites on the dendrite. And if enough of them bind, anybody have a guess what is going to happen in the postsynaptic neuron? It says it on this slide. It'll trigger an action potential. So this is where the two things that we've talked about, the electrical component and the chemical component, all come together. Okay, these chemical messengers, if the neurotransmitter signal reaches the threshold on the dendrite, then that'll trigger the electrical, that'll trigger the action potential. So let's say that I said this last class, and somebody's like, so let's say that on this neuron, its threshold is 7 neurotransmitters. This is a made up scenario. One kid last class thought it was very, very serious. If 6 neurotransmitters bind at a receptor site, is this neuron going to fire? No. Okay. But if 7 or 500 bind, if 500 bind, is it going to fire even faster than if 7 bind? Yes or no? Huh? Same rate, because an action potential is a what? All or none responds. Thank you, Connor. Okay. All right. So these neurotransmitters bind at the receptor site. Okay. And if the signal's strong enough, that will trigger an action potential in the receiving neuron right there. And so on down the line. This is how all messages are carried through the nervous system. I know I've had people before be like, well, I don't understand when this happens. Like every single thing that you ever do in your entire life is due to this process. Anything that you are doing right now, whether it's biting your nails or listening, eating something, all of that is due to this process. All right. Any questions here? There's one more slide. Now, neurons, the axon terminal will generally release more neurotransmitters than can bind at the receptor site. And some of these excess neurotransmitters will just kind of diffuse and be degraded. They'll just diffuse into the synaptic fluid and be degraded. But some of them, the firing neuron, the axon terminal, this one right here, is going to suck back up and recycle them to be used again. This is called reuptake. Reuptake is taking back up excess neurotransmitters. Because like even the ones that bind don't go into this dendrite. They actually just they bind and then they get released back into the synaptic gap. So it's basically like this neuron. If I say, hey, will somebody take this message down to Mr. Engel, but come right back. All right, that's how neurotransmitters are. They take the message there, but then they come right back because they live in this one. Okay, because this is where they're produced. Now, we're going to talk later on in the class what happens when reuptake can't occur, which is something that happens with drugs like cocaine. But reuptake, so they fire, all right, and then excess neurotransmitter is either going to be degraded or is going to be sucked back up into the axon terminal to be repackaged to use again. All right. Are there any questions about reuptake? No? Neurons naturally, as long as they are not overused a lot, neurons can make more. So part of the reason why we have to sleep is so that neurons can produce more of the neurotransmitter. But that's what happens with things like if you have a big so people who are like addicted to heroin, okay? Heroin is what's called an agonist for endorphins, which is a natural painkiller. Eventually, after doing heroin enough, your body stops naturally producing endorphins. And so people who are going through heroin withdrawal are in a ton of pain because of it, because their body is not naturally producing that neurotransmitter anymore. Eventually, it will, as long as those neurons aren't dead, but it can sometimes take a while. That's why like with other drugs too, like cocaine, you're like up for like 30, 45 minutes and then you crash. All right. It's because basically those neurotransmitters have been depleted from the drug. Does that answer your question, Landon? Yep. We'll get more into that later on. All right. Any other questions? I did. I recorded this one. It'll be posted. Okay. All right. So here's just another graphic that you can look at with this whole process. Another graphic that you can look at. and then 2-minute neuroscience. All right, so last thing. We're going to watch a quick video, just kind of reviewing all of this. And then you'll be able to go and do your own thing.